A dry wind moves across a red plain at dawn. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a line of rifle smoke lifts briefly into the air, then disappears. There are no flags raised, no declarations read aloud. Only men and women moving quietly through tall grass, carrying what weapons they have, knowing the response will be swift and violent, but moving anyway. Long before the world would call it decolonization, before speeches at the United Nations or ceremonies of independence, resistance was already alive, breathing, and learning how to survive. Across Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, colonial rule did not arrive as an abstract idea. It arrived as tax collectors demanding cash from subsistence farmers. It arrived as surveyors driving stakes into ancestral land. It arrived as forced labor quotas, pass laws, corporal punishment, and courts where African testimony carried little weight. For many communities, the first years of colonial rule felt less like governance and more like siege. The disruption was total, economic, political, and spiritual, and it cut through societies that had governed themselves for generations. In the Ethiopian highlands, messengers rode for days to warn villages of advancing Italian columns. In the forests of Kenya, elders debated whether compliance would preserve their people or destroy them more slowly. In Algeria's countryside, families watched land that had sustained them for centuries reclassified and transferred, field by field, to European settlers. These were not moments of sudden outrage. They were accumulations of pressure, experienced daily, leaving fewer and fewer paths that did not end in submission. If this story holds you now, stay with it. By the end, you'll see how resistance that began with scattered acts of defiance nearly unraveled some of the most powerful empires on Earth, not through spectacle, but through persistence, adaptation, and an understanding of power that colonial planners never fully grasped. What unfolds next is not the story of a single uprising, but the slow ignition of a continent. Early resistance often took forms shaped by older political orders. Chiefs refused to collect taxes. Religious leaders declared colonial authority illegitimate. Warrior societies mobilized with weapons designed for conflicts that predated machine guns. These first confrontations were usually crushed. European armies possessed artillery, repeating rifles, and logistical networks that local forces could not yet match. Battles ended quickly. Leaders were executed, exiled, or humiliated in public ceremonies meant to demonstrate the futility of defiance. But suppression did not produce submission. It produced memory. Each defeat taught lessons. It revealed the enemy's patterns, how columns moved, where supply lines stretched thin, how seasonal rains slowed vehicles and softened roads. Communities learned which actions provoked total retaliation and which forms of resistance could be sustained quietly. In many regions, overt confrontation gave way to something more patient: evasion, concealment, and the preservation of autonomy wherever it could still be found. Colonial administrations mistook this silence for acceptance. Reports sent to London, Paris, Lisbon, and Rome often spoke of pacification and stability. But beneath the surface, resentment was reorganizing itself. The dismantling of traditional authority did not erase political consciousness, it redirected it. New leaders emerged: teachers, clerks, veterans of colonial armies, men and women who understood both indigenous societies and the machinery of empire. Economic policies sharpened the conflict further. Colonial economies were designed to extract, not to develop. Cash crops displaced food production. Migrant labor systems fractured families and spread anger along railways and mining compounds. In cities, Africans lived under segregation regimes that reminded them daily of their exclusion. In rural areas, land shortages forced younger generations into wage labor or rebellion. The choice was increasingly stark: adapt to a system designed to keep them subordinate, or resist it in ways that no longer resembled the wars of the past. World War I deepened these contradictions. African soldiers were conscripted or recruited to fight in conflicts that were not their own, exposed to global ideas about rights, sacrifice, and power. They returned home having seen Europeans bleed, retreat, and die like anyone else. The myth of invincibility weakened. The empire no longer looked eternal. By the 1930s and 1940s, resistance was no longer anchored solely in tradition. It was becoming political. Associations formed, then parties. Demands were first framed in the language of reform: better wages, land access, representation. Colonial governments responded unevenly, granting concessions in some places while tightening control in others. Every reform delayed created space for organization. Every repression created martyrs. Ethiopia's resistance to Italian invasion stood as a warning and an inspiration. Despite brutal occupation tactics, including chemical weapons, resistance fighters refused to vanish. Haile Selassie's appeal to the League of Nations echoed far beyond Europe's chambers, signaling that African sovereignty was not a relic, but a claim still being fought for. The lesson was unmistakable. Colonial rule could be challenged not only locally, but on the world stage. Elsewhere, repression intensified. Emergency laws expanded. Detention without trial became routine. Villages were relocated, forests cleared, and food supplies controlled. These measures were meant to sever fighters from civilian support. Instead, they often achieved the opposite. Entire populations were drawn into the conflict, not as combatants alone, but as suppliers, messengers, and witnesses. Resistance was no longer something that happened away from daily life. It became embedded within it. What emerged from this pressure was not chaos, but evolution. Armed resistance was no longer an act of desperation. It was becoming a strategy. By mid-century, the foundations had been laid. The grievances were shared, the lessons learned, and the belief had taken root that colonial rule was not merely oppressive, but vulnerable. What began as scattered defiance was now preparing to transform into something more coordinated, more disciplined, and far more dangerous to imperial control than colonial planners had anticipated. The quiet before the storm was ending. In the mountains and forests where colonial maps grew vague, a different kind of order was taking shape. Camps appeared where no permanent structures stood before, hidden along ridgelines, river bends, and footpaths known only to local guides. Here, resistance was no longer reactive. It was being trained, supplied, and disciplined. What had once been remembered as loss was now studied as instruction. Across North Africa, East Africa, and the Portuguese colonies of the South, armed movements began to formalize. In Algeria, the National Liberation Front built cells that operated independently, so the capture of one would not expose the rest. In Kenya, fighters swore oaths that bound them not only to secrecy, but to a shared political purpose, transforming grievances into obligation. In Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique, small units learned to melt back into villages after ambushes, indistinguishable from the civilian population that sustained them. These were not spontaneous uprisings. They were systems under construction. Terrain became a weapon as decisive as any rifle. Mountains disrupted aerial surveillance. Forests absorbed sound and movement. Deserts stretched supply lines until even mechanized armies felt exposed. Fighters who lacked heavy equipment compensated with time and familiarity. They chose when to strike and when to disappear. Each engagement was designed less to win territory than to exhaust the opponent, to force colonial forces into a state of constant response. Support networks grew alongside the fighters themselves. Civilians provided food, shelter, intelligence, and recruits, often at immense personal risk. Women carried messages through checkpoints. Children watched roads and counted trucks. Elders preserved oral maps of paths that never appeared on paper. Resistance was no longer confined to the battlefield. It was woven into daily life, making distinction between combatant and civilian increasingly difficult for colonial authorities, and morally perilous when reprisals followed. External connections deepened the transformation. Neighboring territories offered sanctuary across porous borders. Weapons flowed in slowly at first, then with increasing regularity, shaped by the emerging Cold War. Some movements received training abroad, returning with new doctrines adapted to local realities. Others learned in combat, refining tactics through trial and error. Victory was never assumed. Survival was the measure of success. Colonial administrations recognized the shift, but struggled to respond effectively. Conventional military doctrine, built for decisive engagements and clear fronts, faltered against dispersed adversaries. Patrols moved through hostile terrain without reliable intelligence. Garrisons became targets. Roads and railways, once symbols of imperial control, turned into vulnerabilities that required constant protection. Attempts to isolate fighters from civilian populations often backfired. Forced resettlement, collective punishment, and mass detention eroded whatever legitimacy colonial rule still claimed. Each village burned, or family displaced, produced new recruits, not fewer. In trying to suppress the insurgencies, colonial governments expanded them. The balance of power began to blur. Colonial forces still possessed superior firepower, air support, and resources. But they were losing something less visible and more essential: certainty. No longer could administrators predict where authority ended and resistance began. No longer could they claim that unrest was marginal or temporary. Large regions slipped into a state of contested control, governed by competing systems that both claimed loyalty and obedience. Inside the resistance movements, debates intensified. Leaders weighed military action against political messaging, discipline against spontaneity, unity against local autonomy. Mistakes were made. Internal conflicts emerged. But even these struggles reflected maturity. These were organizations planning for longevity, not gestures of defiance meant to end in martyrdom. By the late 1950s, the consequences were unmistakable. Colonial governments were deploying more troops, spending more money, and exercising greater violence, yet achieving less control. Emergency powers became permanent. Wars once described as police actions required divisions, airstrips, and entire administrative overhauls. The cost of empire was rising sharply, measured not only in budgets, but in credibility. What had begun as resistance was now warfare of a new kind: adaptive, decentralized, and relentless. Colonial authority still stood on maps and in official communiques, but on the ground, it was being tested daily, stretched thin across territories it could no longer fully command. The transformation was complete. The fight had moved beyond protest or rebellion. It had become a sustained challenge to imperial power itself, and the empires were beginning to realize that this was not a problem they could simply outlast. The first signs of crisis did not arrive as dramatic defeats. They appeared in reports marked confidential, in casualty figures that no longer declined, in requests for reinforcements that never seemed sufficient. Colonial control did not collapse all at once. It began to fray, thread by thread, as administrators confronted a reality they could no longer explain away. In Algeria, entire districts required permanent military occupation, yet remained fundamentally ungovernable. In Kenya, emergency regulations expanded until civil authority itself seemed secondary to security forces. In Portuguese Africa, small wars multiplied across vast distances, forcing Lisbon to fight on several fronts at once with an economy ill-suited for prolonged conflict. The promise of order, the moral justification of empire, was eroding under the weight of its own enforcement. Colonial armies were stretched thin, tasked not only with combat, but with policing, intelligence, and administration. Soldiers trained for conventional war found themselves guarding villages, interrogating suspects, and patrolling terrain where every civilian encounter carried uncertainty. Morale suffered. Tours of duty lengthened. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, visible only at the moment of attack. Economic strain followed. Infrastructure required constant protection. Trade routes were disrupted. Resources once extracted efficiently now demanded armed escorts. Colonial budgets ballooned as military expenditures consumed funds previously allocated to development or governance. In the metropole, taxpayers began to question why distant territories demanded endless sacrifice without visible return. International scrutiny intensified the pressure. Reports of mass detention, forced relocation, and systematic violence reached global audiences through journalists, missionaries, and diplomats. The language of empire, order, progress, civilization collided with images of camps, destroyed villages, and censored trials. At the United Nations, newly independent states challenged colonial powers openly, reframing African conflicts as struggles for self-determination rather than internal disturbances. Colonial authorities responded with escalation. Counterinsurgency doctrines grew more aggressive, relying on surveillance, collective punishment, and psychological warfare. In some regions, these measures achieved temporary tactical success, but they also deepened political isolation. Every victory came at the cost of legitimacy, both locally and abroad. Within resistance movements, confidence hardened. Survival itself was interpreted as proof of eventual success. Fighters measured progress not by territory held, but by the enemy's reaction. More troops, harsher laws, louder denials. Each escalation confirmed that colonial power was no longer secure enough to rule quietly. The human toll mounted. Civilians bore the brunt of the struggle, trapped between competing demands and subjected to suspicion from all sides. Entire societies were reorganized around conflict, normal life postponed indefinitely. Yet even this suffering did not restore colonial authority. It exposed its limits. By the early 1960s, several colonial systems stood on the edge of breakdown. Military victory remained elusive. Political compromise appeared increasingly unavoidable. What had once seemed unthinkable, the loss of entire empires, was now discussed privately as a matter of timing rather than possibility. The crisis was no longer confined to Africa. It had reached the capitals of Europe, forcing leaders to confront a truth they had resisted for decades. Empire could not be maintained by force alone, and force had become the only tool left. The near collapse was not sudden, but it was unmistakable. Control survived on paper, but in practice, it depended on emergency measures that could not be sustained forever. The question was no longer whether colonial rule could endure unchanged, but how much damage it would inflict before it finally gave way. The breaking point did not arrive on the battlefield alone. It arrived in courtrooms, newsrooms, and parliamentary chambers thousands of miles from the fighting. As African wars dragged on without resolution, they began to reshape the political centers that had once directed them with confidence. At the United Nations, debates over colonial conflicts grew sharper. Delegates from Asia, the Middle East, and newly independent African states framed the wars not as internal security matters, but as violations of international principles. Resolutions condemned repression. Commissions investigated abuses. Even when enforcement was limited, the effect was cumulative. Colonial powers found themselves defending actions they had long treated as unquestionable. Global media accelerated this shift. Journalists embedded with troops or smuggled reports from detention camps brought distant wars into living rooms. Images of razed villages, barbed wire enclosures, and exhausted soldiers challenged official narratives of control. Public opinion in Europe fractured. What had once been justified as a civilizing mission increasingly appeared as an endless, morally corrosive struggle. Cold War politics added another layer of pressure. Both the United States and the Soviet Union viewed Africa through the lens of influence rather than empire, but neither could ignore the conflicts unfolding there. Some liberation movements received material support, training, or diplomatic backing, complicating colonial military campaigns. At the same time, European governments feared that prolonged wars would push African movements toward ideological alliances they could not control. Inside the metropole, dissent grew louder. Students protested. Veterans questioned the purpose of their service. Political parties fractured over colonial policy. In France, Algeria destabilized governments. In Portugal, colonial wars consumed resources and manpower, binding the fate of the regime to conflicts it could not decisively win. In Britain, the cost of emergencies abroad increasingly clashed with post-war reconstruction at home. African resistance movements understood this shifting landscape. Military action continued, but political messaging became equally vital. Leaders framed their struggle in universal terms: rights, sovereignty, dignity. Language that resonated far beyond their borders. Each international debate, each headline, became another front in the war. Colonial authority now faced erosion from multiple directions at once. Military control was contested on the ground. Moral authority was challenged globally. Political will weakened domestically. Even where colonial forces maintained tactical dominance, the strategic picture had turned bleak. Victory no longer promised stability, only further isolation. Negotiations, once dismissed as premature or dangerous, became unavoidable. Some transitions were carefully managed. Others unfolded amid violence and uncertainty. But in each case, the decision to withdraw was shaped less by sudden defeat than by the recognition that empire had become unsustainable. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the pattern was clear. Armed resistance had not merely forced concessions, it had altered the cost-benefit calculus of empire itself. What once seemed a permanent global order was revealed as contingent, fragile, and ultimately reversible. The collapse was not uniform, nor was it complete. Colonial structures lingered in economies, borders, and institutions. But the age of unquestioned imperial rule in Africa was ending, not through gradual benevolence, but under the weight of sustained pressure from those it sought to dominate. The struggle had escaped the continent and entered the conscience of the world, and there, empire found no easy refuge. When the fighting finally slowed, it did not end with triumphal marches or clean conclusions. In many places, it ended quietly, through negotiated transfers of power, hurried departures, and flags lowered at dusk. The world recorded these moments as independence, but on the ground, the legacy of resistance was far more complex. Former fighters returned to villages changed by years of conflict, Some were absorbed into new national armies or administrations, their legitimacy rooted in sacrifice. Others were sidelined, carrying skills forged in war into societies struggling to redefine themselves. The unity demanded by resistance proved harder to sustain in peace, where ideological divisions, regional tensions, and personal ambitions resurfaced. Colonial systems did not vanish with withdrawal. Borders drawn for administrative convenience became international frontiers. Economies structured for extraction remained dependent and vulnerable. Security forces inherited methods shaped by emergency rule. The tools used to fight empire were, in some cases, repurposed to consolidate new states, blurring the line between liberation and control. Yet the central irony endured. Empires that once claimed permanence had been forced to retreat by people they had systematically underestimated. Armed resistance did not always achieve total victory, nor did it guarantee justice or stability. But it demonstrated that colonial power was not inevitable. It could be contested, strained, and, in crucial moments, pushed to the brink of collapse. Across Africa, the memory of that struggle persists, not as a single narrative of heroism, but as a record of endurance, adaptation, and consequence. It reminds us that decolonization was not granted. It was compelled. They did not dismantle empire with spectacle. They did it with time.